having a few people join. Good morning, everyone. We'll wait for more people to join. A lot of people are just logging in now. All right, as we wait for more people to roll on in, I just wanted to say hello and good morning. My name is Lydia Zapeta, and I am part of the Women of ALPFA committee. So on behalf of the Women of ALPFA Boston, I would like to thank you all so much for joining us today for our annual Latina Summit. This year's event is extra special because we are also in the midst of Hispanic Heritage Month. So what better way to celebrate than surrounding ourselves with so many Shiros and Latino allies. So a few little housekeeping notes before this event is being recorded. And as we go on throughout this session, I encourage you all to use the chat and drop in any questions that you may have for our amazing panelists. And we're almost ready to begin. But before I do, I wanted to introduce our fantastic moderator, Carola Levia. She is the Associate Director of the Women of ALPFA Boston. So a little bit about Carola. She was born and raised in Chile. She holds a bachelor's in engineering, and after earning her MBA from Babson College, she has entered the tech industry. For over 10 years, Carola has been leveraging her talents in analytics and leveraging those in strategy roles. Currently, Carola is a data-driven product manager at Klaviyo. And of course, she serves as the Associate Director for the Women of ALPFA. So welcome to the virtual stage, Carola.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I appreciate your words. I'm very excited today to moderate this panel discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of our panelists how they have embraced their uniqueness to pave their own road to success. So let me tell you a little bit about how things will go this morning. We will begin with a set of questions, and while you're listening, please, I encourage you to write any question that you have in the chat box at any time. I will basically go through certain questions that I have for the panelists. And after all the questions that I have, we will start asking the question that you had submitted. We want your participation, so please don't hold back. And as a quick reminder, today's event is being recorded. Now, let me introduce you to our amazing panelists. First, Giovanna Rosales. She's a Director of Community Building at Lead Media LLC. Giovanna is a community builder, entrepreneur, and community builder consultant, co-host at Making Leader Move podcast, Latinx speaker, event producer, and has a merchandise business. She's passionate about community as it has helped her accelerate professionally, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. Giovanna knows community is key and vital to make it in business and in life. That's why she's so passionate about all the work she creates for her clients. Thank you, Giovanna, for joining today. Now let me introduce Dr. Yes. Now let me introduce Dr. Jessica Honseka. She's Manager Director at Latinos for Education. Jessica spent 24 years of her career in public education, serving in multiple roles as a classroom teacher, department chair, principal, and superintendent of school district in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. She has always focused on ensuring high quality and equitable instruction for students. She also holds a Master of Art in Education, a doctorate in leadership in schooling from University of Massachusetts, and an advanced certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion for Cornell University. Thank you, Jessica, for joining. Finally, but not least, Omari Aarons is managing partner at Aaron Group. Omari is a disruptive leader and transformational coach with over 15 years of experience in corporate America. He's a strong champion of inclusion. He's a proud mentor and director for Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Eastern Massachusetts. He's also the inaugural president of the National African American Insurance Association of Boston. Omari has received numbers of honors for his commitment to community building and civic engagement. Omari is a graduate of Xavier University in Cincinnati and is a Howard Thurman Fellow at Boston University School of Theology. Finally, he's a World Human Certificate professional. Thank you, Omari, for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start with the questions. I want to hear from each of you in this question, and I will start with Giovanna. Giovanna, what has been your most memorable boss move and why?
Yeah, I think as a business owner, I had done freelancing for a while, and I finally decided to move over from being a freelancer to business owner. And I think the boss move there was making an LLC. And the reason why that was the biggest move is because all of a sudden I need an EIN number, right? So all of a sudden government is getting involved. Like taxes are legit. And all of a sudden I'm opening up business accounts, right? Like going to the bank and stuff. And that made the mental switch to like, oh, going from gig to gig to like, oh girl, you're a business owner now. So now you have to make sure to have plans to keep moving forward, making sure that you're on track to get your business where you want to be in a year.
Amazing boss move. Thank you, Giovanna. Let's move on to Jessica. Jessica, what has been your most memorable boss move and why?
Well, this is a hard question. You know, in my roles as superintendent, I think there was sort of three that are equal. So I'm going to be real quick with them. I think the first one, when I was receiver in Southbridge, we didn't have the budget for it, but there was clearly a gap, a technological divide of our students, which, you know, over 60% were Latino, in their access to computers. And so we basically shifted a significant amount of money to ensure that every single child in our schools had a Chromebook and they were able to access technology. Another big boss move that I made was in my last district, the majority of our third and fourth graders were not learning how to read. So I required all of the teachers to take weekly professional development in literacy instruction so that they actually, and this, I got grieved by the union and there was a significant amount of pushback. But the children's, you know, that foundation of reading was so important, and our scores have continued to improve since then. And the last and final big boss move that I think I made was in reprioritizing our budget. That first budget year, I slashed 21 paraprofessional positions to put in place smaller class sizes, social workers to be able to deal with the social and emotional health of our kids, reading specialists, and just put it in the needed staffing that was critical to really meet students' needs. And that also got a tremendous amount of pushback because, you know, shifting money, right? When you don't have, you don't have all the funds in the world because budgets are tight, making those really critical, hard decisions for what's best for kids in order for them to get opportunity and access has to come before the adults. And sometimes that gets a lot of pushback from unions and communities who, you know, their neighbors and their friends are in those positions that need to go because there's higher priorities for students. So I would say those are some pretty big boss moves.
And very impactful as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Omari, what has been your most memorable boss move and why?
Well, I mean, and after those stories, I'm like, I don't know. I would say for me, I think about instances where I've had to stand up for what's right, and particularly stand up for perspectives for people who are not in the room, who've not been invited to sit at the table. And so not one particular instance like really jumps out at me, but I just remember in so many places where I've been the only person of color in the room, where I've been normally the youngest in the room, though that's changing as I continue to get older, and feeling like, gosh, do I even have the right to speak? And thinking about, I'm in this room, and I have a perspective to add, and I'm also carrying the perspectives of other people. And so really finding that courage within myself to speak up and to speak out, particularly about decisions that are impacting people who don't have the access that I've had. And that for me it's always been my biggest flex, is using my voice and the seat that I have to speak for people who are normally not in those spaces that I occupy.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can all relate to that. And I think that's a very quick way to move to the second question that I have for each of you, which is related to our tagline. Basically, Latina Summit this year is about embrace. So the next question for each of you is, how have you embraced your uniqueness to get you where you are today? And let's start with Giovanna again.
Yeah, I think it's just being confident in who I am, not being ashamed to make room for myself at a table, and creating my own table, right? And being confident with what I know, sharing, and not being ashamed of what I don't know. Even field, experts are always learning, right? Scientists are always discovering new things. So they don't always know everything. You're not always going to know everything, and it's okay to ask for help. I think that's one of the biggest things. Timid and afraid, because it's like that's where imposter syndrome starts developing, right? Like, oh, if I don't know, then I'm really an expert. It's fine. You're not going to know everything. Cool. So I think just having the confidence of knowing what you know, who you are, and not being ashamed to ask for help when you need it are the attributes that I've used.
I love what you say about creating your own table. Thank you so much. Jessica, how have you embraced your uniqueness to get where you are today?
I think just that kind of fearless spirit, that taking the approach of like, what if, being unapologetic, right, for doing what's right and following your heart and following the values that you have as a leader. And I think I've always just gone by the mantra, we can't accomplish what we don't try. And so I would rather apologize for trying and failing than apologize for not trying at all. And that has really kind of driven my philosophy in this really important work.
I think I'm going to steal your mantra. It's a really good one. So yes, we can accomplish what we don't try. Did I say it right?
Yeah, we can't accomplish what we don't try, right?
Yes, I'm going to steal it. Thank you, Jessica. Omari, same question.
I'm stealing the mantra too. So there we go. I think we all are. I think each of us brings a unique skill set, right, to whatever role. And for me, mine has always been around words. And so I get a little quirky, I would say, when it comes out, at work. And often it comes out, in editing, in ghostwriting speeches, in the PowerPoint world that I've lived in corporate America. And I really think through very carefully what words I'm going to use, what the impact of them is, what's the emotional context that we're really trying to convey in words. And so my allegiance to words normally makes people roll their eyes. Because my team would always give me something that they put together and I'd come back. It's like the red pen editing. And I'm like, different suggestions on how we could say things. But those words, and as as Dr. Jessica talked about, like the literacy piece of that being so important, particularly when you're communicating with a base that's first language might not always be English, or their level of proficiency within English might not necessarily be high, even as native speakers. Words for me have such meaning and such power. And so in every role that I've had, I've always carried that particular skill and lens on the messaging, whether it's about diversity inclusion, or if it's about employee engagement or policy change, that's customer facing or employee facing, just really leaning into that particular skill set and passion that I have about language.
And again, I can relate to that. English is my second language, so I can definitely relate to that. And after hearing all your inspiring stories and like how you embrace your uniqueness, in order to help all of us develop our own boss move, in the next question, I want to know what attributes do you have developed what attributes you had to develop in order to make those boss moves? And Giovanna, I'm going to start with you again.
Yes, absolutely. I think as an entrepreneur, consistency is very important, because there's going to be some days that you don't want to show up, right? Like weather's changing, question is real. So you have to use tools around you to make sure that you excel within whatever you do. So like, for example, I'm a community builder. I help build and retain communities. So what do? I schedule in the beginning of the month what I'm going to have laid out, whether that's our virtual, whether that's engagement, because I know that either one, I'm not going to be motivated to do it at 6 a.m. or two, there's always an emergency, right? Like my breaks out, I'm not going to get to it on time. So just ensure that you're consistently and showing up fully. The second, I would say, normalize fail. I've talked about it before. We just heard Dr. Jessica talk about it. She has a mantra for it. Make failure normal and don't to your head about it. Without her, you won't be able to grow. So just see that as a growth. And the last one that I would say is make yourself visible as within your industry. By you being visible, that's when people are, asking for you to do speeches, whether it's to be their next client, whether they're going to be your next client. Say consistency, clear, and visibility.
Yeah, so like consistency, make yourself visible, and normalize failures. Did I get it right?
Yes.
Really good advice. So thank you, Giovanna. Jessica, same question. What attributes do you have to develop in order to make boss moves?
I have three too. I think the very first attribute that you absolutely have to be bold in whatever context you work in is resilience. You have to be able to, if you're going to take on equity work and be an equity warrior, you have to have the resilience to push through when you get pushback. And that pushback many times is very severe just because of the systemic orientation and structures that exist, right? The next thing that you really have to be able to do is persevere, right? Just like Giovanna said, you have to be able to get up in the morning and put one foot in front of the other, even when it looks like there is no way, right? And that's why my faith is such a big part of my life, right? Because I believe, all things are possible, all things. And there is a way through anything. It's always just not easy. And last but not least, you have to know who you are. You have to know your why and hold on to that like at your core. Because if you don't know who you are and why you're doing what you're doing, when the pressure comes, and it will, and the challenges come, that's when leaders begin to falter and they begin to waver. And that's why we don't see the access and opportunity, especially for our most marginalized communities, really at the place that we all want and desire them to be. So.
Thank you so much. So you say resilience, persevere, and know who you are, which is basically your why, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Omari, what would be your answer?
Yeah, well, I'll stay in this game of three and say my three are imagination, persistence, and self-care. So imagination, it is the number one quality that I look for in people that work with me. And it's for people who can see what doesn't exist yet and see beyond what people say that they want and really being able to see what they need, right? So it's the visionary aspect of, here is the landscape today. What do we want the landscape to be in 3, 4, 5 years? And what are the steps that we take to get there? Everyone has commented on persistence, right? And so particularly now as a business owner stepping out on my own, everything is up to me. And so if something is wrong, if a social media post is misspelled, if a deadline is missed, like that is 100% me, right? So there's a pace in which you have to set and hold yourself accountable for what it is that you're trying to do. And equally important is that last one, which is self-care. It's hugely important to listen to your body. There are moments where you just can't do everything. And the choice that you're really making is stepping away from the computer at 9 o'clock at night, rather than continuing to go until 1 or 2 a.m. Or 3 a.m. sometimes, like getting something done and continuing to push yourself, or having a breakdown where you're going to be wiped out for a week, right? And so it's like when your body is telling you, you have to take this break now, even though you have this thing to get done, you have to step away and learn to listen to that and trust your body. So that way, you might be able to get up early the next day and get it done, right? So, just taking those breaks is something you can't afford to miss, and paying attention to what your body's telling you. It's the hardest lesson that I've been learning. And I say that actively because I'm still working through that. I am famous for just 10 more minutes and I'll go to bed, right? And then 2 hours later, I'll still be tinkering with a PowerPoint.
Yeah, and like it's so hard, and nowadays that like your personal life and your work is basically just mixed. I think we all need to like have our priorities clear, and self-care is something so important. So thank you so much for sharing that. So now I have one in-depth question for each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Omari. So can you talk about some of the challenges that you have encountered as a person of color when trying to make boss move in corporate America?
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, where to start, right? The experiences of being the only one or one of the few have been a constant in my career as I've advanced. And compounded, as I said earlier, by often being the youngest person in the room. And so and with that, sometimes the most junior person in the room, right? Coming in as a senior director, but everyone else in the room is a senior vice president or an executive vice president or a chief officer. And so even though like having authority to represent a group, right? Your authority level changes based on who you are in the room with. And oftentimes I was in the room as a subject matter expert, or someone making a proposal, not necessarily as the decision maker. And more as you advance in your career, just because of the numbers of where people of color fall in corporate America, and not always advancing to manager ranks or to senior manager ranks or to C-suite with profit and loss responsibility, being part of a circle, being part of a culture that where there are people who can show you the path, I would say has been the most difficult thing, right? There weren't a lot of people ahead of me. I think twice in my career, I've had someone more senior than me who was a person of color that was in my direct leadership chain, right? And that's out of working at this point 17 years, since graduating college. So the numbers are very few. And so finding someone to talk to, finding someone to be a mentor and to help show you the ropes, I think is something that's critically important, and it's for your survival as well as helping you thrive. And that means in many cases, finding people that are outside of your direct organization. And so this is why I think organizations like ALPFA are so important, is they are the places that can provide that network that doesn't naturally exist inside of your own organization at times.
And like, let me ask you, because I'm so curious, and I'm pretty sure everyone wanna hear this, is that any advice to find those right mentors inside or outside of the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. One is just ask people, right? Like it's getting in the spaces where you're meeting people at events like this, where you see people who are on panels and who are speaking, who have advice. I would say, on the mentor ask in particular, people see someone and they go, oh gosh, Jessica seems like she has it all together, and Giovanna's doing exactly what, I want to do in my career. Like, she should be my mentor. And like, maybe, right? Like maybe that person should be, but that person also might be able to connect you to somebody who is actually going to be a better fit. So I wouldn't reach out to people and say, like, I need you to be my mentor. I would reach out to people and say, I want to have a conversation with you about your career, about my interest, where I'm trying to go. And, through that conversation, the person might say, let's keep in touch. Let's do this more regularly. Or they might say, I have some people that I really want to connect you to, because I think you having 3 or 4 conversations with 3 or 4 different people is actually going to get you what you need.
Thank you so much for that advice. And I'm pretty sure you are open the path to many people, and like find you as a role model, and maybe like many people will want to be a mentee of you. So, and I know that you are helping in Big Brother Big Sister as well. So
thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Jessica, so given your experience and exposure to many students and future leaders, what is the biggest hurdle, I cannot even pronounce that word, hurdle, for Latinx in their path to leadership? And what would you advise them to overcome those challenges? You are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, the biggest hurdle on the path to leadership. From my experience in working with, Latinx teachers, future Latinx leaders, what I hear a lot of is they just feel like their voice has just been completely dampened in their school organizations, right? And so what I would say has both been a benefit of mine and, a challenge, is that I was never afraid to push on status quo, right? Agitating was not, it wasn't a foreign thing to me to really kind of call out, the structures that excluded some students from other students. And so I would say, the biggest hurdle that many of our Latinx, leaders need, and future leaders need to get over, even as teachers, is have the confidence, right? Develop the confidence and the efficacy to speak up and not be afraid, right? Because the more people that speak up, I always say this, the silent majority is so large. It is so large and so vast. And what keeps us from coming together and mobilizing is fear, right? And the feeling that we don't have the agency to really come together in community and make change, demand change, right? And that's why our schools still look the same as they did in the 1800s. And so I really would really just encourage people, just develop that confidence, develop that efficacy, develop the collective efficacy of those in your communities, and then have the agency to really demand the changes that need to happen in order for us to achieve true equity. Being a young woman, I was the youngest superintendent when I first took the superintendency in Massachusetts. I was a female, I was a Latina, and I also was very outspoken. And as a woman, that can be perceived by some as aggressive, right? Why are you so aggressive? And I'm like, I'm not, I'm passionate. I'm passionate about this. I'm passionate about children, about ensuring all succeed. And so I really just encourage, young people to find their voice. That is the biggest hurdle I really believe that we need to get over in public schools.
That's so true. I have had the same issue. But how do you basically find that voice? How do you get the confidence to speak out? What advice would you give to everyone that is hearing right now?
I just would ask myself, I remember the first time that I spoke up in a faculty meeting and I was a very young teacher, and I remember my voice shaking. I literally stood up and I pushed back against what the majority of the teachers were saying because it wasn't best for kids. And I remember shaking in my boots. And the thought that came to my mind before I pulled myself out of my seat was, what if I don't? What if I don't? And what is the worst that can happen, right? If I do. And so, and from that point on, like, it gets easier and easier and easier, right? Like, after that, the second time I stood up and, pushed back, my voice didn't shake as much. And then other people who thought the same as I did, they would come to me and say, I agree with you. And I was too afraid to say anything. And slowly but surely, you find that you have allies that you didn't even know that you had, because there were a loud minority that just had all of us in fear. And so I would just say, ask yourself, what if I don't? And what's the worst that can happen if I do?
And here I remember your mantra right now, which is apply perfectly here, right?
That's right.
And the other thing that you mentioned about knowing who you are and why you're doing what you're doing, right?
Yes. Pull from that. You need that strength if you're going to do this work.
Yeah, and I see that strength in you. I hope we all develop that strength. Thank you so much for sharing that. Giovanna, I want to know everything that you can tell us about your podcast, Making Leader Moves. Where can people listen to it, and what type of conversation can we expect on it?
Making Leader Moves is the podcast that brings powerful Latinas together to discuss that our comunidad is facing and what that it took in life to prioritize joy.
I think we're I didn't got all the things that you say. I think we're having issue with your internet. Giovanna, can you hear us?
I'm going to leave and then come back in.
Okay, perfect. Because I want to know all about that. I think this is a perfect conversation for this panelist, where we're talking about making boss move. And this is a podcast that basically Giovanna has about making leader moves. So it's the perfect conversation to have with Giovanna and understand what can we learn from that. Yes, Omari.
Well, I was going to say, I love the part that Giovanna just shared with us about prioritizing joy. Right. I think there's a perception of being a boss that has a negative connotation. It's the Miranda Priestley from The Devil Wears Prada kind of connotation. You're just directing people around and you're like purely evil. But I think one of the key things about being a boss is not just finding joy for yourself, but also helping other people find and experience joy. And that's a perspective I don't think that we talk about a lot in terms of leadership and the responsibility that you have with leadership, but also really one of leadership's greatest rewards. Helping people find their voice, finding that courage to be able to speak up and speak out, to come into rooms, to build the room and the table and all the people invited into it, right? There's such joy that I've always derived from that as a leader. Knowing that it didn't want it to start with me, and in many cases I've been the first and the only, but certainly on the other side of that, making sure that I would not be the last person, and not just trying to replace myself, but trying to replace me with 3 or 4 other people, right? So that you have a real pipeline of people coming through, and there's such joy and power in that. So I'm really glad Giovanna's podcast prioritizes joy, because I think that's an essential component of being a boss and being a leader that we don't talk a lot about. So I'm looking forward to the podcast.
Yes, and create their own table was also something that Giovanna mentioned before. So that's a really good point. Giovanna, we have you back.
I'm hoping that it works better. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to start over. The podcast, basically it brings Powerhouse Latinas together to discuss the challenges our comunidades are facing and what moves they prioritize, or I'm sorry, what moves they took to prioritize joy. So some of the different that we have are balancing, right, work-life balance. When is it time for you to move on career or your job? Dress code, is that even a thing now in the workplace, right? Depending on, are you working from home, having to go to an actual corporate job? And then mindset change. And I know that mindset change was something that I spoke of earlier today. And so, yeah, I think you're right. And then Paulette and I, who's also going to, she's a speaker. She's going to be on later on today. Definitely go see her. But Paulette and I, right, like we were the disruptors in that. We're like, you know what? We need to make space for ourselves. Amplify the voice, the Latina voices that are creating change, and then also disruptors, and make others realize, like, we're here. We're visible, and you're not alone. You're not alone in this work-life balance. You're not alone with having a hard time changing mindset. Right? Is even as a business owner, you're doing that on the daily, or working corporate America, you're doing that on the daily. So just create space for us Latinas to be our authentic selves and know it's okay to prioritize joy and have balance in life. It's just awesome. It's awesome. And I love it.
So where people can listen to this podcast?
Yes. So can be found on Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and if you want to see our lovely faces and not just listen to us, we can be found on YouTube as well.
And you share a link as well in the chat, right?
Yes. I think Paulette did.
Oh, okay. I just saw the link and I was assuming that was you. Sorry.
Yeah. See, there she is.
Thank you so much. And I feel like Omari was saying when you were just out for 1 minute about how your podcast is really good to prioritize the joy. And I think you give a good summary of what the podcast is. I'm like looking forward to hearing the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Before we go to the questions, if you have any questions, I will ask a final question. And basically, I think Omari was saying a little bit about this, is that how the boss word has something like intimidating when we think about boss. So making boss move can sometimes be scary and intimidating. What would you say, and I'm going to ask everyone about this, what would you say to someone who is hesitant to make their next boss move? And Giovanna, let's start with you.
Sure. I think you just have to put it in your head that there's never going to be a perfect time, right? Like that was always my excuse to become a business. Like, oh, I just need to finish this course, or oh, I need like 2 more patients, or oh, once I did all that, at the end of the day, the intimidation is still there, right? The scariness of the not knowing is still there, no matter how prepared you are. So knowing that there's never going to be a perfect time, so just do it. Just do it. And you have to be okay. There's this book that I recommend to everyone. It's called Brave, Not Perfect. And it talks about, I think, something else that we, that we have a lot of difficult with is, especially Latinas, or people of color, is, oh, I have to be perfect in order to be an expert, right? Or like, it has to be perfect in order for me to launch it. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. There's always going to be glitches. I mean, I'm having glitches right now, right? Like I had to leave and come back in. Like, that's okay. It's not a big deal. It's imperfect, but at least I was brave enough to get on stage. So being brave enough and knowing that there's never going to be a perfect time, I think are the two takeaways.
And that's so good. I feel the same way. For me, is that language is a huge barrier. I just came to US 5 years ago, and I still struggle with what Umari was saying, English as a second language, and I always try to be perfect, and it's impossible. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah. Or like even in just like something little, right? And like this is something that I had to grow out of. I would read my emails before sending them out 5 times. Like one for grammatical. Am I writing it all first person or did I switch over to third person? Like I got so into my head losing time. And I'm like, this next person on the other side, they know at the end of the day what I'm trying to say. If there's a little grammatical error or if I didn't edit it 100%, it's okay. The point is getting across. It's fine. I missed the period. Oh, well.
Yeah, same. I read the emails 100 times. Thank you so much.
We need to stop. That's why, right? That's perfectionism. That's perfectionism.
Jessica, what would you say to someone who is hesitant to make their next move, boss move?
Well, I agree with everything Ivana said. I guess what I would ask them is, 10 or 15 years from now, or if they look back, or, at the end of their life, if they look back, that moment in time where they could have, taken one of two roads, right? Would they regret having not at least tried? And what would they have missed? Had they not, just stepped out and had the courage to even try, right? Because, I agree. I think, Yvonne talked earlier about failure, right? And I used to say this to the kids and the teachers that I worked with, like, make F your new A, right? Because it's such, you have such an opportunity, right, to grow from even just taking the risk. And then, right. And what you have is a broader and bigger toolbox to apply to the next time.
That's so true. When you think in like 10 or 15 years from now, you put things in perspective, right?
Totally different perspective, right? And the older I get, the more I realize that. And I want to have sort of that mantra at the end of my life, no more regrets. No more regrets.
Okay, I'm going to steal that one as well. I'm sorry, I'm stealing everything from you. Omari, what would you say to someone who's hesitant to make their next boss move?
Yeah. Part of this is, and I think part of the fear and intimidation around becoming a boss comes from the fact that, many of us have had really bad bosses as well, right? We've had people who have been charged with our care and our responsibility inside of organizations who misused that and abused it and didn't really take it well, right? And so, the question that I always ask for people is like, how do you define being a boss? And like, what does that look like? And what does that mean for you, to make sure that we're not building our definition of boss off of, or as the antithesis of a very bad situation that we've had, right? And to really look for leaders that are multipliers. The book that I love is Multipliers, How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Better, by Liz Wiseman. Absolutely amazing book. The other thing that I say about being a boss, like once you define like what being a boss is that you can be a boss wherever you are, right? I think sometimes we think of, and I'm very proud of being an entrepreneur. I like the fact that I have stepped out and created my own business. And I also think sometimes we over-index on being a boss means leaving an environmental structure and means that you have to start your own business. And so I think if you want to start your own business and that's what you're passionate about, I always encourage people to do that. And you absolutely should. And understand that you can also be a boss within an organization, right? And so thinking about what your span of influence is, how do you open doors for people? How are you thinking about and helping others to think about 2-3 steps ahead? All those are boss moves as well, right? So if you want to start your own business and be like literally your own boss, by all means, and I'm happy to share anything from my journey around that as well. And I want people to also like keep in mind, you can be a boss inside of the organization, like that whole bloom where you're planted piece. When I was at Macy's, I was there for 9 years. And that was right at the height of, you know, all the studies around the millennial generation and all of us leaving jobs every year or so. And I had friends that bounced around, but I stayed there for 9 years because I had 7 different jobs in 9 years and I had been promoted 4 times, right? So you can also build a successful career within an organization. And so I just want people to always have all of those perspectives as they think about what does it mean to be a boss and decide how they want to boss up and in what spaces they want to be a boss.
That's so interesting. You are the clear example that we can be bosses everywhere. What would you say that is the biggest difference between like working in corporate America versus now being an entrepreneur, like when you do boss moves?
Yeah, well, 2 things. One is the team around you, right? Like I think being inside of an organization, there's an infrastructure of support that exists that you're really handed, right? Like when you're in an organization, you're in this position, in this team, in this part of the hierarchy for this particular organization. And as an entrepreneur, you have to build that support. So you might not, you know, you have a colleague on your team who's really good at editing. You've got another one who has a great visual, you know, design eye, right? And that's a skill set that you can tap for different projects. And it's all right there. When you have your own business, you have to go find people in your network to be that team for yourself, and they become your partners. And the other one is money. It's cash flow, right? Both on the side of like when you're working for a Fortune 500 company, you know, there's money to experiment and do different things with, and your comfortability level with taking risk when it's not your own money is different than when I'm being funded by the bank of Macy's or Liberty Mutual. Is very different than being funded by the bank of Omari Aarons, right? So you're thinking through how you're spending money, where you're spending money, you know, very differently when it is your money, right? And you're going, I'm making an investment in myself, and I'm also taking a risk. And so just understanding what a smart investment looks like when it's your money is different than a smart investment when you have a pool of money or a budget and you're trying to decide between A, B, C, and D.
Yeah, that's so true. I am not an entrepreneur, so I cannot say anything, but maybe Giovanna, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm
sorry to put you in the spot.
100%. No, I think he's 100% on the ball in order for you to be successful, because entrepreneurship, right? You can even be a solopreneur, and that gets very lonely, and it can get very hard at times because, right, your peers around you, well, the majority of my peers, right, have 9 to 5, so it's hard for them to understand some of the struggles that I have or the daily issues that I have. So you have to create your $1 million squad, right, which is your support team. And again, know where your strengths are and know where your weaknesses are. Like with my teams, I'm like, there's certain things that I'm just like, listen, you're a boss at this, take over it. Like, this is not my forte, this is not my thing, and this is why you are in the driver's seat and I'm on the passenger side, right? Like, I know that you have to know what you're good at, what you're not good at, or what you're willing to give to the other handful. And I think going back to boss move is knowing where to place your workmates or your collaborators, and just kind of how do you say it in English? Like, just vibe off of one another and make sure you're making the best service or the best product, because both of you are now not worried about having to do 4 different tasks. You gave them 2, you have 2, and now you're able to be in your zone of genius together and come out with phenomenal ideas. To give someone else the drive, good at it, or if they're better at you than you are. Like, that's what it is to be a boss.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm not seeing any question in the chat. So I'm going to jump and like ask my own question. I had so many. So I'm going to continue with the question. Unless someone has a question in the chat, please put it put it there because we want to hear what are your questions. So, and we only have 8 minutes left, so I'm going to jump quickly to know the not shiny moments in your career where you were trying to make boss move and something went wrong. Can you share, Giovanna, a story around that?
Yeah, I think it was probably first, right, when I decided to go from freelance owner. Like I was like, okay, I'm going to get an LLC. How do I do that? I go, who can help me? And Google can only do so much, right? Like we breathe Google in, but sometimes you're like, is it really $600 to open up an LLC? I don't know about that. So I would say it took me a lot longer just because I ended up doing a lot more research. I, asked around, asked my different support groups, my different communities. I ended up just doing it myself. I was just like, this is not as, but again, I live in Chicago. I heard New York is a whole nother beast. So I guess that was probably it, right? Was the fail or the hard time was when I had decided like, okay, I'm going to do this. It took me a few months to find this is how you're going to do it.
Thank you for sharing that. Jessica, do you have anything to add for a not shiny moment in your career where you were trying to make a boss move?
I think my one really painful moment in my career was because I made boss moves, right? It wasn't that I was trying to make them, it's just that I had made them. My first year, in my last superintendency, requiring high quality literacy instruction in every classroom, right? Changing the budget. And interestingly enough, when the pandemic hit, my district was the only district that had social workers in every school that were able to address the mental health needs of students because of the moves that I had made. I had to, remove $1 million benefit from the teacher's contract in order to keep taxes down for the rest of the community, right? So these were like really, really tough decisions that had to be made for the benefit of kids. And that, I remember this distinctly. It was the Monday of the week of Teacher Appreciation Week. And we're at a board meeting and all of these teachers showed up in these t-shirts that said Milford Strong on it. And I had this whole speech written out to thank and commend and give my gratitude to all of the teachers. And they got up at public comment and said they had done a vote of no confidence. And it was a small portion of the teachers union. It wasn't all of them. It was like just a small portion of them. But the way that they presented it was just like, it was so painful. And I still had to give my gratitude speech to the teachers after that. And everyone said that I did it with such poise and with such grace, but like, I can't even tell you how painful it was to have that done in such a public manner, right? But that's leadership, right? That is public school leadership. And so, I marched on from there. And if you talk to anybody on my leadership team from that district, they'll tell you that they'd never met a more resilient, sort of poised individual that took, sort of the punches right in the face with grace. But I wouldn't change anything, right? Because again, like I have to go back to why I do what I do. And if I could just share this with you, like, this is why I do what I do. Do you see these kids? Right? So like,
yes,
this was when I was in Southbridge. I actually shadowed this boy for a day, a senior, and I actually pretended to be a student. And they didn't realize that I was the superintendent for 3 periods. I got away with it. They thought I was a new kid in class. And I got to like, I totally dressed like a kid. I had my book bag, I had my schedule, I shadowed him all day long. And I was able to learn things as an administrator of the true experience of my Latino kids. And I even had lunch with them, and the lunch was terrible. Like after that, we put Spanish food in our cafeteria. We wound up like changing our menu. But I just wanted to say, like, again, going back to my answer before, you have to hold on to that why. And remember, that's what you're there for, regardless of all the other noise that comes.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so inspiring. And like Omari, we want to hear from you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the no confidence piece is a tough one. I remember taking over a team, and they had taken a employee engagement survey, from their previous manager, and really hit this manager hard on their survey. But since they were reporting to me, it became my survey results, right? And I remember thinking, gosh, this is so unfair, right? Like now I'm ranked at the bottom. This isn't even my fault, right? This is totally somebody else's fault. And I remember, my manager at the time said to me, listen, it's your team, right? Like this is how your team feels about management. And that part is agnostic of who their manager is. It's built on these experiences that they've had with managers in the past. And so he's like, it is your problem. And I went home and I had a bottle of wine. And and then I was like, okay, you're my team now. These are things that we can fix. And it's one of the proudest stories that I've had. We went from being like one of the 10 worst rated teams to being a top 10 team, where we got an award for our increase in engagement, not just for the building that I was in, but for my entire division. And that was work that we did together, about how to create the environment where people could thrive. So I'm really proud of that moment, and it's learning from the failures, right? Whether they are yours or they're ones that you inherit.
And we're running out of time, but I'm going to link that to a question that we have in the chat. Omari, do you think that helped to the imposter syndrome, or like, is that something that you can use to?
It absolutely is one of the, that's, I think, the importance of finding a network of people you can talk to as well, because it is a human thing for us to experience doubt, right? It is a human thing for us to have wonders about, am I doing the right thing? Am I thinking the right thing in this particular situation? So having people you can talk to is really, really important.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we're running out of time, so I want to close this panel first by thank you all our amazing panelists today, Giovanna, Jessica, and Omari. Thank you so much for your insight. I found it extremely helpful. I steal many things from you guys. And I hope we all feel more prepared now to start making our boss move. Also, please join us for the rest of today's event. We have Bossing Up Without Burning Out at 2 p.m., The Power of Us at 4 p.m., and Cheers and Friends United at 6 p.m., which is our networking event. And finally, thank you once again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.